Hello, I'm Mark, and this is In the Round, On-Armature Bust Tutorial Series, Part 11, Definition, Refinement, and Posing. Having developed the features individually, our next task will be to sculpt them together, filling in and articulating the more subtle transitional structures. We'll start by assessing the broad masses and proportions of the head, building up or carving away as necessary. Pay particular attention to the crown and the occipital, as they typically need some bulking up at this point. If you're sculpting short hair, you can mask that in too. See Part 12 of this series, which covers short hair basics. This will help you to better see the overall proportions of the head. If you're sculpting long hair, which I cover in Part 13, you'll want to wait until after posing the bust. Attend to the more subtle structures of the cheek and brow, including the hollow below the zygomatic bones and between the volumes of the masseter, risorius, and zygomaticus major. The three-quarter view curvature of the orbits back from the zygomatic bones and up into the superior temporal line. The volumes of the frontal eminences. Be sure to also check the underside of the jawline as it transitions into the neck. This area can be easy to overlook. Assess the profile line as you rotate the work. Be sure to look at your bust from many different angles and distances. Step back from it, crouch down and look up at it, stand in a chair and look down on it. Continue to confirm and reconfirm your measurements. Check your symmetry as you go, both visually and using your hands. It can be advantageous to look at your bust in a mirror or to take pictures and reverse them. We all have certain perceptual biases that can prevent us from seeing asymmetries, and flipping what we see can reveal those biases. Once the overall masses look good, we'll proceed with a series of increasingly subtle definition and refinement passes. By definition, I mean specifically the transitions between caught light and cast shadow. Sharp transitions create strong definition, smooth transitions soft. This isn't a question of the degree of contrast, but the sharpness and clarity of the transitions between fields of different values. Both low and high contrast value differences can have either sharp or soft definition. And both can be sculpturally useful. Because sharp definition areas are clearer, they become focal points, while areas of soft definition recede. By controlling the level of definition, it is possible to create a kind of sculptural sfumato, guiding viewers' focus to the areas of sculptural significance. This is a principle called emphasis and subordination, and when used with control and intentionality, it can create a specific balance and rhythm to a work. This is one of the ways that sculptural technique deviates from representational fidelity. Edward Lanteri also recommends that you articulate anatomical structures using small, planar spaces of rest rather than acute angles. These firm, slightly curved flatnesses, which the subcutaneous bones cause, form, by their tranquil simplicity of aspect, a contrast to the variable alternative roundness of the muscular fibers, and give an impression of resistance, which at the same time detracts from the monotony which would exist if an even roundness of form prevailed all over the figure. Though it's good to be aware of these techniques, they're a bit advanced for beginners. At first, I'd recommend favoring sharp definition over soft. This will help you to better understand the often subtle and ambiguous structures of the body before settling into a more general or controlled refinement. Above all, avoid articulating structures using gentle concave grooves such as are made by the pads of the fingers. In Part 1 of this series, I said that it can be useful to think of sculpting as analogous to value drawing in light and shadow. This kind of concavity captures and diffuses light to create a mid-tone gray, a visual dead zone. Articulating anatomy in this way leads to structural islands separated by sculptural voids. Everything ends up looking vague, uncertain, and ill-defined, and vague definition is very different from soft definition. To avoid this common mistake, it can be helpful to think of the convex curvatures of each structure as intersecting with the curvature of the next. Note that even Lanteri's spaces of rest are sharply defined planes rather than smoothly rounded valleys. Indeed, this is so important a point there's a sculptural aphorism that states, "There are no concavities on the body." Though obviously this is, strictly speaking, untrue, it's meant to reinforce the importance of the sculptural principle. Consider a torso bending to one side. Globally, it's a concave curve, but that larger curve comprises a series of intersecting convex curves at the pelvis, flank pad, thorax, and latissimus dorsi. You will also want to avoid using hard-angled grooves for definition. This is a less egregious error than using smooth concave grooves, and easier to correct, but is still something to watch out for, as it will formally flatten your structures, making something of a line drawing of them. Remember the principle of intersecting curves. The best tools for defining structures are loop tools, compression tools, and coarse, stiff-bristled flat brushes. Work your way around the bust, defining and shaping as you go, making small additions of clay where necessary. Again, remember to look at the bust from a range of angles and distances. Having clearly defined the larger structures of the face, it's time for a refining pass. The purpose of refinement is to eliminate superficial turbulence in the forms, allowing you to better see and assess them for correctness. It's very important, however, that you only smooth away extraneous features. Be cautious not to efface necessary structural definition, refining away the anatomy entirely until you're left with a featureless egg. The best tools for refinement are abrasives like scouring pads and reticulated foam, and soft, flat, or fan brushes. For broader structures, careful use of serrated loops and flexible ribs is also appropriate. Unless you're working with a very smooth-bodied clay, avoid wiping with sponges, as they tend to pull up the fine particles and leave the coarse ones, resulting in an unpleasant sandpaper-like surface. You can, however, dab with sponges to lightly texture the clay, blunting its shininess, which will help you better see surface variations. As should be obvious, the process of definition and refinement is very lighting dependent. Ideally, your bust should have well-defined structures and smoothly refined surfaces in all lighting conditions, but this can take a remarkable amount of effort. I wouldn't recommend worrying about it much early on, when basic structural correctness is still the priority. Nevertheless, it's good at this point to start varying your lighting a little. Use a clamp light to cast a hard raking light across the sculpture from high, mid, and low angles. Work your way around, assessing how the light falls across the surfaces. This can be a very revealing exercise. Once you've completed your first refining pass, it's time to reassert any definition lost in the process, redefining your structures more correctly, more subtly, and at a higher level of detail. Continue defining, refining, and redefining until you're more or less satisfied, remembering that final detailing will have to wait until after the bust is off the armature. This process can take some time, but with practice, your path to the finished form will be more direct. For now, it's good to move incrementally, as this will help you to better understand both the anatomical structures and the balance between definition and refinement. It is now time to pose your bust. If the clay is still relatively moist, this will be easy. If it's dried out a little, then it could take some force, and the neck may crack. This isn't anything to worry about, you'll just have to work clay into the cracks and sculpt over them. Take your bust off the turntable. Holding the head firmly, bend and tilt it to the desired angle. The weight of the bust should be sufficient to hold it in place for this, but if it isn't, you can clamp the base of the armature or have someone hold it for you. Once you're satisfied with the pose, return the bust to the turntable. You will need to re-sculpt the neck to conform to the pose you've chosen. If you've turned the head sharply to the side, the forward-facing sternocleidomastoid will pop out dramatically, while the flesh of the neck on the other side will bunch up and wrinkle under the jaw. If you've tilted the head back, you'll have to sculpt in similar compression wrinkles at the back of the neck, unless you plan on covering that area up with long hair. You can now establish the direction and focal length of the gaze. The focal length is the point at which the gaze converges. Imagine a line coming out of the pupil of each eye. If these lines intersect close to the bust, the gaze will be focused, engaged, and intense. If the intersection is further away, the bust will seem more distant and dreamy. This effect will be more powerful the closer to parallel the lines of the gaze become. Controlling the focal length of a bust can have a subtle but powerful tonal impact, suggesting a figure's presence or absence from the viewer. There are several options for how to render an iris and pupil in clay. If you're ultimately going to pigment the bust, you can simply work in a thin disc of clay to create the elevation of the cornea. Note that this elevation will in turn lift up the lid, pulling its curvature in the direction of the gaze. If the bust is to remain monochrome, you'll have to imply both the color and reflectiveness of the iris and pupil in light and shadow. Typically, this is done by carving in two concentric depths, a deeply shadowed inner depth to create the black of the pupil, with a shallower ring around it for the iris. The depth of this iris will determine how much light it captures, and thereby suggest the value of the eye, deeper corresponding to darker, shallower to lighter eyes. For very pale eyes, this ring is sometimes elevated off the eyeball, rather than carved into it. The size that you make the pupil will also suggest the amount of light that is shining on it. A small oval of clay is then inserted to catch light and to suggest the reflectiveness of the eye. If you neglect this reflection, the eyes will look very flat and beady. Even if you've carved into the eyeball to articulate the iris and pupil, it's still important to imply the corneal elevation by lifting the lid and pulling it in the direction of the gaze. There are a few more nuances to go over when it comes to eyes, but they will have to wait until final detailing, after the bust is off the armature. For now, with the bust fully masked in and posed, and with the gaze established, it's time to move on. Join me next time for part 12, where I'll be covering the basics of sculpting short hair.